My name is Mariam Ehsanger. I'm PestFacts SA newsletter editor, and I am hosting the webinar today. The Department of Primary Industries and Regions acknowledge that the traditional custodians throughout South Australia and their continuing connection to the land, waters, and community. We pay our respects to all members of the Aboriginal community and their cultures, and to elders both past and present. In today's webinar, we have 4 senior research scientists sharing their expertise with us. First of all, we have Dr. Maartin van Heldon giving us the seasonal outlook for grain establishment pests. Dr. Kym Perry will then be talking about the snail control. Dr. Kate Muirhead will discuss slug control, and Dr. Nicole Thompson will then talking about turnip yellow virus in South Australia and canola. And then we will finish with a question and answer session. So please use the Q&A tool in this webinar to ask any question you may have. The microphone and video for all attendees will be kept off for the webinar, so please use the Q&A tool. And I'll now hand it over to Maarten.
So good day, everybody. My subject today will be the risk related to pest during the established phase of the crop in 2025. And let's be honest, this is a very, very difficult year. As you all know, the actual problem we have is not the insects. The actual problem is the lack of rain. And as you can see, this is BOM data on rainfall efficiency over the last 15 months. And you can see we've had the rainfall lowest on record, which is not very promising. And if you look at the root zone soil moisture, so how much is there actually in the soil, then the situation is also quite disastrous. There's simply no moisture in the soil. So even if you have sown already, the crops will not be out of the ground unless you have irrigation available. But yeah, for most grain growers, that is not available. So you will just be hoping that at some stage the rain will come. If you look at the long-term weather forecast, unfortunately, there's no big rainfall events being announced. Let's just cross fingers and hope that that will arrive at some stage. Low rainfall, very late crops. What influence could that have on actual pest? So in most cases, it's relatively simple. If it's very dry and very hot during the summer, then pest will probably be reduced. So overall, I think that the risk of pest pressure will be lower than in other years, which could maybe help you save a little bit of money by reducing your initial prophylactic insecticide applications. I'll have to admit that we're not actually sure about every individual pest that could be around, so we'll go through them a little bit more. What's also important to know is that plants that are stressed because of drought can be more prone to insect attack, simply because, well, there's already reduced growth, so the same pest can do more damage. The plants are maybe not capable of actually defending themselves against the insects. They just don't have the possibility to grow new leaves or whatever chemical reaction they can have. And quite often stressed plants are actually better food for some of the pests. Often because of, well, people say sugars, but usually it's more like amino acids that change. Typically, Russian wheat aphid is an aphid that thrives on water-stressed crops. They first have to come into the crop, and I don't think they will come this year, but we'll talk about it later. So if you think about all the pests that we can have during establishment, we can roughly divide them in a couple of groups. And I also add natural enemies here at the end. So we have the ones that are already in the paddocks that have been oversummering as adults or as larvae somewhere in the ground, under rocks, in cracks. Earwigs and weevils are typical examples. Some pests are actually oversummering in a resting stage, a diapause stage, which is a very good adaptation, and red-legged earth mite and lucent fleas are the two examples. And then, of course, you can have pest flying into your crop once your crop is trying to get established. Moths, locusts, aphids, all these things can arrive. And the last example that I will talk about very quickly is natural enemies. So if we go through those different groups, and we start with the earwigs and the weevils, so the ones that have larval or adult populations that are oversummering. we strongly suspect that they have been reduced. And we know that already, that earwigs are typically linked to the higher rainfall zones. The higher rainfall zones this year are very, very low rainfall zones. So we presume that the populations of these pests have actually been reduced, but there is no good way of measuring that. We don't do that. It would be great if we could count every insect in a paddock and somewhere down the cracks, but we can't do that. But to be honest, we think that there will be a reduced survival, so you'll probably have much less of these in your crop. And there has been no green ridge on which they have been feeding. So to be honest, for these pests, I really think there will be a lower population than in previous years. The few pests that actually over summer in a resting stage, in what we call a diapause, usually in the egg stage, story is a little bit different because those egg stages are actually completely designed or there to survive those hot and dry conditions, and they're basically just waiting. So, and these eggs will emerge. On the top right, you have a photo of a red-legged earthmite female that actually transforms basically in a bag of eggs, and that's how she survives the summer, or the eggs survive the summer. And they're just waiting for rainfall events. They need enough rain. They need sometimes low enough temperatures, depending on what species it is. There's quite good knowledge on that, but it also means that we probably have the same population levels as we have had in previous years. And there's quite a couple of tools available. I presume everybody is aware of something like TimeRight, which will allow you to actually think about controlling red-legged earthmites in the season before. There's also quite an important influence of the paddock history. What was your crop before? And it's well known that if you had a paddock before, sorry, a grazing paddock, then the risk of red-legged earthmite in the next season is much higher. So there's quite a table available where you can actually estimate the risk on the GRDC sites. And then at some stage, when it starts to rain, they will all appear. And because the rain is still waiting and the crops are waiting, if that happens, it might be that the red-legged earthmite and also the lucent fleas will arrive exactly at the same time as your crop is coming up, which in that case might increase risk a little bit. Very difficult to predict that more precisely than that, but good observations are probably essential once you have your crop in to see if there's any high populations of lucent fleas and red-legged earthmites appearing. And then, of course, there's all those migratory pests, the ones that are actually not in your paddock yet, but might come. They could potentially have built up somewhere else, especially in areas with rain. And the question is, will they start migrating? Will there be a risk of them arriving in your crop? Just be aware that in general, insects will only start migrating if there is a good reason for that, which means usually that their food is either running out or deteriorating in quantity, or the density of that pest is very high. In that case, they can sometimes start migrating. That is still quite an effort. Temperatures is already going down at the end of the year. The summer crops have been harvested. It's quite classic to have pests from summer crops moving to winter crops. We don't have that much in South Australia, but in New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland, sorry, that's a much more known phenomena. Typically, when the cotton's being harvested, all the pests from the cotton start migrating somewhere else because there's no more food for them, and then they can go into other crops. Overall, I think this risk is really very limited, but keep your eyes open. You never know what's going to happen. These pests can sometimes fly really big distances. And if you've been looking into the news lately, you've seen that there have been a couple of weird big migrations. We had a story of the soapberry bugs that all of a sudden appeared in the riverland, apparently because their food source, the soapberries, were drying out, and they all started migrating, and they all came to the riverland where there's still some green and some things to eat. This can happen. Keep your eyes open, but I don't think we need to anticipate anything very serious this year. And then some of the smaller migratory pests, such as aphids and diamondback moth, which normally would live and multiply locally if there's a green bridge. DBM can migrate. Historically, we expect that they're actually building up more on the western side of our state and then move over to the east if the conditions are right. It's dry everywhere. There's very, very little green bridge. There's very little populations. We do see them appear again on some of the weeds, and potentially they might be a bit more numerous if there are irrigated cropping areas of crops where they could develop on. Potato crops, irrigated potato crops can be a source of aphids, but overall, over South Australia, where there's no nearby irrigation crop, I think that risk is really very low. The last thing is then, how does that influence things like natural enemies? Well, unfortunately, there's very little good knowledge about where natural enemies survive over summer, how they build up. We presume that they will build up on the green bridge, so we need plants. On these plants, we need pest insects like aphids, in which case natural enemies can build up on there. This year there is no green bridge. There's very little alternative food for these natural enemies, so we think the natural enemies will also be very late to arrive this year and in small numbers. There's a couple of GRDC and SEGET projects on that. One of them is a big project called Canola Alleys, and we hope in a couple of years to have a better visibility on the dynamics of natural enemies that could help control pests in your crops. As you have understood by now, generally speaking, we think the risk is less this year than it has been before. Let's hope that we will not have, on top of a problem of drought, also an insect problem popping up. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Well, it's lovely to talk to everybody. My goal here today is not to tell you everything that's going on in regards to snail research. There is quite a lot of research going on behind the scenes, which is designed to develop some new approaches to snail control, involving some new technologies and some engineering solutions and things like that. But today I just want to be quite simple about this and just focus on what's happening with the weather and what's happening with snails right now. So how does the weather drive snails? Certainly mollusks are extremely responsive to weather. And if we fast forward, if we rewind back a couple of years, I was presenting this slide, which was, why are there so many snails? And the story a couple of years ago was that we had a very, very wet spring, and the snails were able to extend their breeding activity and survive and grow extremely well. And there was a lot of snails at harvest, and many of those carried over the summer and survived very well. And there were high numbers in the following autumn. And this is the sort of thing we were seeing on roadsides, extremely high abundances. So if we continue through and look at rainfall anomalies, weather patterns are always really interesting, and usually they're a very good predictor of what's happening with mollusks. So these maps basically show how far above or below average rainfall has occurred in each month of the year. So from that wet spring, the snails carried over, and that year breeding conditions were quite decent. We had good rains in April and June, and snails were able to do their thing quite well. And again, there was quite a few issues with snails at the harvest time. As you can see, in that particular year, the weather dried off in late winter and spring, and what that can do is drive snails into the crop canopies earlier. And so this is the sort of thing that you can't really predict until it happens, and that's the same situation this year. So once again, we had a couple of years of high survivorship of snails, and we had a wet summer the previous year, at least in the middle of summer, and the snail population was pretty high at that point. But then, of course, somebody turned the tap off, and last year we didn't really have a season break at all. And these weather maps look rather bleak. I'm sure you've all seen plenty of those by now. As you know, snails breed primarily in the autumn, and this continues through to midwinter, early spring. And snail populations in spring generally depend on how much rain occurred during that breeding period. If you get high rainfall at the right time, then snails are able to produce quite a few offspring. Whereas if it's dry, then breeding will be much reduced. And in fact, there's a much closer relationship between autumn rainfall and spring numbers than there is the numbers that you started with in the autumn. So in other words, in some years you might start with quite a few snails in the breeding period and not have that many problems at the harvest. And that can purely happen because the weather wasn't suitable for breeding. All right, so we've had 12 months now of pretty terrible conditions for crops and pretty terrible conditions for the mollusks. And I guess if you've got snails, that's one piece of good news that's coming out of this. You've had a lot of help from the weather in keeping snail numbers down. So we're starting from a very low base this year. It remains to be seen how much rainfall we're going to get from now on. Hopefully it's a lot more than last year. It's been so dry, in fact, that we've had trouble setting up our field trials because we can't find any snails in any of the paddocks where we normally absolutely flush with them. So it's a good position to be in regards to snail control. I guess the question is what to do from here. So what does this mean? Is it a chance to take a break from snail control? Well, there's a couple of things I'll point out. First of all, it's good news that snail numbers are so low at the moment. The first thing, though, is that if you've got snails, there's always more there than meets the eye. Once conditions turn around and there is some moisture, it's amazing how many snails can reappear seemingly out of thin air. And the fact is that those snails have been there hiding in refuges and so forth. So they do have the capacity to reappear under good conditions. And the longer you work on snails and the longer you're managing them, the more you get used to looking in the right places for them. Inside those canola stalks, right at the base of stubbles, things like that, inside weeds, under refuges, that's where they'll be. The second thing to remember is that snails can bounce back from low populations very quickly once the rain returns. And the best way to kill juvenile snails, of course, is to prevent them being produced through reproduction in the first place. So if you can kill the parents, then you get a very good return on investment in snail control. And as you can see, the round snails, a single breeding pair can produce up to 3,000 eggs. It's about 10 times less than that for conicals, but it doesn't take many snails to rapidly rebound. Now, integrated management is obviously critically important for snails. Over the summer we've just had, first of all, weed populations will have been far lower than normal, and that's good news for snail control because the presence of weeds can increase survivorship by 50% or more. So you've already had an excellent piece of natural control going on there, but weed control always comes first. If you have done your cabling and rolling, I expect that will have worked better this year than in most years because there's just not the residues that there were and not as many places for snails to be hiding, and the snails will then be exposed to all of these treatments. The other thing, of course, is that heat waves kill snails. Basically, temperatures of 60 degrees or above will kill snails instantly. And on a hot summer day, if it's 35, 38 degrees, that sort of range, your soil temperatures can reach 70 degrees on the ground on a sunny afternoon. And if there are not the residues there, a lot of snails will just be cooked. And I think that's what's happened this year. So control is more effective than normal. Now, those getting an excellent start with summer control means that snail baits, again, should be much more effective than normal because the population has been greatly reduced by the weather. There are not as many obstacles around. So this is good news for baiting as well. And, of course, right now is the critical time to bait. Once we get to crop sowing, the only strategy you have available is to bait and try and get maximum return on investment. Just to point out to the audience who may not be aware, the snail management manual was comprehensively updated a couple of seasons ago, and all of the sections are downloadable. So in particular, right now, you might want to download the section on molluscicide baiting, which provides some guidance on how to get the best out of your investment. My quick thoughts on baiting for this year would be not to go easy on any areas that have snails. We know sometimes people are tempted not to bait their pasture phase, for example, but I regularly see densities of 1,000 snails per square metre in pastures that have good residue levels in them. And, you know, it's really setting up a problem for the following year if those are not controlled. And as I said, snails can bounce back. It might also be tempting to skimp on rates, but we know from our research that you really need 30 pellets or more per square metre to maximise the chance of snails encountering the baits. It might be that this year you can get away with a single bait application, and we hope that's the case. But of course, monitoring is the key after you reapply. Again, spreading pellets evenly is really important. Some of our research is moving towards things like variable rate baiting, but we're not quite there yet. So at the moment, spreading those pellets very evenly is key. And then getting the timing right. So you have to bait before they lay eggs. And in most cases, there shouldn't have been any egg laying beginning now in most locations, unless you've been lucky enough to have some local moisture. And the second part of that, of course, is you need to bait when snails are on the move. I'll come back to that in a second. Just to point out, page 26 of the snail menu provides a product selection guide which tells you how many pellets per square metre you'll get at the label rates for each product. And if your product has less than that, you can reapply it as necessary. One thing we've noticed in the last couple of years is that the millipedes, if you've got them, will absolutely smash snail bait. And we've seen instances of the bait going inside half an hour if you've got millipedes. And just to illustrate this, one of our cameras we've had out a month ago picked up this activity, 3rd of April on York Peninsula. We put out a few bait pellets to see what would happen, and these millipedes just absolutely mowed through it. So that needs to be considered because the snails won't have anything left to eat. On the timing issue, one of our projects has developed some cameras that work remotely, and we're using these now to monitor snail activity in near real time. So myself and the SEPWA group in Western Australia and the Stirling's Coast group are all monitoring our local cameras, and we're providing growers with updates on what's happening with snails. We are working towards automated AI processing of all of these images, but for now, we're learning a lot from looking at these. The best way to be updated is to follow those groups on the socials and follow myself on social media, because I'm regularly posting what's happening, and my details will be at the end of my slides. This is a video from about a month ago on Lower Peninsula, and on the left, these are a couple of nights, a few days apart, and even though it's been dry as, we're still seeing snail activity very much on the increase, and this is now 5 weeks ago. So on the left, overnight humidity, as shown by the blue line in the graph below, got to about 90 to 95%, and brown snails were definitely on the move under those conditions. Not the conicals though. On the right, humidity got a little bit higher, and we noticed more conical snail activity occurring. So, yeah, I guess the key message is just because you're in bed doesn't mean nothing's happening in regarding to snails, and be on the lookout for those nights where a bit of drizzle might be expected to get humidity near 100%. And I'd be putting bait out. I think it's possible to get a very, very good kill on movement like this at this time of the year. So I wouldn't be too shy, even if it doesn't rain heavily. Final slide, really just to point out that we have, and GRDC have invested quite heavily in snails in recent times, and so has SAGIT. There are 3 projects happening at the moment: more effective control of snails, revegetation for enhanced biocontrol, where we've now got some plantings established around York Peninsula, which are helping to boost parasitism of conical snails by a fly. We're looking at the issue of liming as well. So farmers that are liming those acid paddocks, obviously having more issues with snails, and we're now investigating what growers can do about that. And anyone is welcome to contact me directly about any of those projects. So just to summarise, it's great that snails are struggling at the moment. Certainly take those opportunities to keep driving the population down. Right now is the time to be right on top of movement activity and putting that bait out. If you're unsure whether to bait, I would suggest putting out pellets in a small area with snails and checking in the morning to see if they've eaten them. Follow me on socials, and I'm happy to take any questions at the end of the session. Thanks very much.
So in Australia, we have 4 invasive pest slugs that cause significant damage to broadacre crops and yield losses that can reach 60 to 80% in untreated areas. And those are the black field slug, the gray field slug, the brown field slug, and the striped field slug. Our project is monitoring all 4 species, but we are focusing on the black field slug and gray field slugs because they are most widespread in grain crops and cause the most damage. So slugs can feed on plant canopy and flowers and developing seed heads. However, the most significant damage and economic losses occur when slugs feed on emerging seedlings. And canola is particularly susceptible, leading to losses. And also, you can see in the bottom picture, that's slugs feeding on fava beans. Minimum tillage, stub retention, and irrigation practices have contributed to increased slug numbers in recent years. And slugs are most problematic in high rainfall regions and seasons in paddocks with heavy moisture retaining soils. So this project was really developed when surveys indicated that there was an increase in slug damage over 2021 to 2023. Which was largely driven by farming practices and favorable weather conditions. Slug populations can increase dramatically when conditions are favorable for breeding. They are opportunistic breeders and will breed once soil moisture reaches 25%. They start breeding between 120 to 150 days old, and each individual can lay up to about 74 eggs per week. One black-keeled slug can breed for 6 to 8 weeks, and black-keeled and gray-keeled slugs have the potential to lay between 300 to 1,000 eggs in their lifespan. Slugs are not uniform pests, so we see all sizes in the paddock year-round. And because of the different growth rates, a slug's weight does not indicate its age or sexual maturity. An egg lay which can make management challenging. So we have seen observed quite small black-keeled slugs of 500 milligrams laying eggs in the field. So the GRD slug investment is optimizing slug management is a 3.5-year project that started at the end of 2023. And this project is being led by me at Sardi, but it's in collaboration with a team of scientists, including Michael Nash, Kym Perry, Tom Heddle, as well as a network of farming groups and consultants. And the objectives of the project were to do some population monitoring over the 3 years and develop a population model and a decision support tool that will help growers assess slug risk at a paddock level. And it was also to increase capacity and capability by engaging a postdoc for research and also training regional agronomists in slug diagnostics, monitoring techniques, and management. So we are also doing spring baiting trials to look at the effect of slug populations before harvest and in the following autumn. And a slug manual is being developed that will look similar to what Kym just presented, the snail manual, and that's for slug management. So for the population monitoring, we have a network of collaborators for 4 farming groups and 2 consultants. And we're monitoring, doing monthly monitoring at 36 sites for 3 years in SA, Victoria, New South Wales, and WA. And the data that we collect from this will help to validate the population model. We're also sending out a seasonal newsletter that will update the farming groups on the population dynamics in the field, and they can distribute that to their network. As well as the regional experts we're training, we have also increased capacity in the slug space by engaging a postdoc, and that's Dr. Tom Heldon. And his research will create comprehensive life histories for the gray field slug and the black-keeled slug, and also build long-term expertise in this sector, hopefully. He has started colonies for these species and is now analyzing how environmental conditions such as temperature and rainfall influence breeding patterns. And his findings will inform the population model and will help growers to assess the threat of slugs pose in any season and whether any action needs to be taken or what strategies will be most effective. He's also going to be doing preliminary urea trials at the Wake campus to see how that affects population dynamics. So a dynamic slug model is being developed by James Carmack at the University of Melbourne, and this model can simulate changes in life stage population abundance as a function of temperature and precipitation, and how that influences survival and fecundity. So this is an example of the what the Shiny app might look like, in which a user can enter lats and longs and a date range, and also then it will spit out growth rates for eggs, juveniles, and adults versus environmental factors such as temperature and precipitation, and also show the slug dynamics of each life stage and the likelihood of risk. So how will spring baiting affect populations? Well, we're doing 4 spring baiting trials across the country, one in SA, one in New South Wales, and in Victoria and WA. And populations assessments will be conducted after baiting in the following autumn, and also plant damage surveys will allow us to determine the impact of spring baiting treatments on crop damage at sowing. So what are we seeing in SA for seasonal slug data in this monthly monitoring? Well, so far we found that slugs were active in the Eyre Peninsula and the southeast of the state, despite dry autumn and winter conditions in 2024. But as Kym mentioned and Martin mentioned, it's been record low dry conditions, no rainfall. So this year we haven't seen any activity across the state at any of our sites, except at an irrigated site in Bull Lagoon and also an irrigated site at the Wake campus. So just to recap, we haven't had any slug activity currently in SA except at irrigated sites. And monitoring found that slugs were active across several regions, despite dry autumn and winter conditions in 2024. So it's really highlighting the need for proactive slug management, and it's a good idea to hit slugs while they have low populations. And one way we can do this is by monitoring. So the economic threshold for gray field slugs is 1 slug per mat before baiting. And bait should be applied after snowing and before crop emergence when soil is moist and slugs are active. We expect to do an even spread of 25 to 30 baits per square meter for effective control. And we also suggest doing early sowing using vigorous seed varieties, which can help crops grow quickly past the vulnerable seeding stage, reducing the window for slug damage. Rolling and press wheels can compact the seed bank, making it harder for slugs to move and access seeds. And then also one of the main areas of management is reducing surface stubble and crop residues, but also managing weeds, and that removes shelters and food sources for slugs and makes the environment less favorable for their survival and reproduction. So I just want to say thank you to all the collaborators. It's a huge network across the country, and I really appreciate everyone on the project. So thank you so much.
Hi, my name's Nicole Thompson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the program leader of the Plant Health and Diagnostics program here at SARDI, and I'm actually a plant virologist by training. So what I'm going to be talking about today is actually part of a larger project, and what we're looking at is whether turnip yellows virus is around in SA canola, and what we did last year with our trapping. So this is a large project, it's a big national project. The $12 million isn't all, unfortunately, coming to little old SARDI's Plant Health and Diagnostics. But we are doing a national surveillance looking at aphids and turnip yellow virus in canola. So that's all I'm going to be talking about today, but it is part of a much larger project involving members of the entomology team as well. So a bit of background, so those who don't know about turnip yellows virus, it used to be called beet western yellows virus, which you may have heard of. That caused a big outbreak in canola in South Australia in around 2013, I believe, with massive losses in some areas. And it is transmitted around by the green peach aphid. So we are looking at using green peach aphid as an easy way of doing surveillance for this virus around Australia. So there hasn't been any really recent big outbreaks in South Australia. There has been in other states, and I'll touch on them a bit later. But the pictures that you can see here on the you can see the aphids that are colonised heavily on the back of a leaf there, and you can see the purpling of the canola leaves on the right. So that's one of the typical symptoms in mature or flowering canola. You get this purpling of the leaves, whereas in really severely affected crops that are very young when they get infected, it can be very, very stunted. So our research question was, is turnip yellows virus still around in South Australia? We don't know. There hasn't been any surveys since the last outbreak ended. And if it is around, is it in aphids or is it in the crop? And what sort of implications does that have for management of this disease around in South Australia? But also, how does that fit into the national landscape of this virus? So what we did last year is we focused on 4 sites for doing trapping for aphids. We had 2 sites which we went to quite intensely, one in Upper Fleurieu and one in the southeast, where we had 4 sites, 3 or 4 sites in those locations. And then we did some limited trapping in the mid-north and around Francis, which is a bit more opportunistic trapping. When I say trapping, all we did was put yellow sticky traps along fence lines. And so every 2 weeks for Fleurieu, we switched out these traps and we painstakingly picked the aphids off, identified the aphids and tested them for turnip yellows virus. And in the southeast, we did them on about a monthly basis. So I'm going to report on what we actually found in those aphids on those 2 sites that we looked at more intensely, and then I'll touch on the other 2 sites as we go along. So this is the results from our Upper Fleurieu location. There are 4 lines on the graph. They are the 4 different paddocks that we surveyed, and the numbers on the right on the axis there are the number of aphids which were counted on these traps. So you can see there was a flush of aphids early, and then it basically went to nothing over winter. And then once spring came, the numbers of aphids then rebounded quite quickly through there. That is absolutely not surprising. It's a pretty typical pattern, and one which is observed in the other states as well. It's nothing surprising there. We were quite surprised by the huge number of aphids early on, but especially since there was actually no canola actually growing at that time. We were at a bare field at that stage. What we did though is we did take those aphids off of the traps individually and pulled them together and did qPCR analysis looking for the presence of turnip yellows virus in those aphids. And the red arrows that we've put on there, that actually shows proportionately how many positive detections we got at those sites. So we had a lot of turnip yellows virus detected early and then also late. And we sort of went down, and it does follow the amount of aphids that you see, which is completely expected. We are biased there. We're only testing the aphids. But we did see a high proportion of turnip yellows virus quite early in the aphids that were detected at that site. At the end of the season, or basically around the end of the season sometime, is when we walked the crop and we took some random leaf samples, and we also did some observations looking for symptoms of the virus which might be present. We found no symptoms at this location at all, but we did detect virus in every single crop that we detected at the end of the season. Now, we saw no symptoms, so there was no losses, but the virus is definitely still present there. Now, there's a bit of a question mark over the early season aphids. Now, I'm a pathologist by training, and I did the first lot of identification at the beginning of the season. Maybe I messed up. Maybe it wasn't green peach aphid. Maybe it was cabbage aphid instead. We're going to do a recheck that this year and see if that early flush. I'll get somebody who's got much more experience than me to do that. And thank you, Rebecca, for counting those aphids for me last year. In our other location in the southeast, we didn't have any early flush of aphids at the 3 locations we checked at where we were trapping. We had lots of other insects on those traps, but no aphids detected at all until much later in the season. So consequently, when we looked at the amount of virus which was in those aphids, obviously we didn't detect any early because there were no aphids to test. But later in the season, again, almost all of the traps had positive green peach aphid with turnip yellows virus on them. And exactly as we saw in the upper Flurio, we also found turnip yellows virus in all of those crops. Now, when we walked those crops, one crop had purple leaves, but it was right on the edge of a road, and it was quite near a gutter. So I thought it could be something else that might be happening there on the edge. But in hindsight, it was probably turnip yellows virus in that crop. So what about the other 2 places we looked at? So in the mid-north, we did limited trapping. We just looked at the traps around the mid-north. We didn't, we had sticky traps near canola, but we didn't actually take any leaf samples from that canola. But we did find green peach aphid with turnip yellows virus in that location as well. And in the southeast, we had a site that was not adjacent to canola. It was a trap for another reason. That one had no green peach aphid and no turnip yellows virus found on it, which was interesting for us. But then we went to a random block of canola, and that was also positive for turnip yellows virus. So we didn't have any aphids from that location, but the crop was definitely infected. So what can that tell us about the season last year? So it definitely tells us that turnip yellows virus, or beet western yellows virus, is definitely present in the mid-north, the upper Flurio, and southeast South Australia. We don't know yet for the other locations. We're going to be doing more trapping and sampling next year, or this year, sorry, it's 2025. Not surprisingly, and in exactly as we expected, it is associated with high numbers of green peach aphid, and when it's an adjacent to susceptible crops, completely expected result. But we did see a very little disease symptoms and very little impact, or no impact at all. Now, there was a very late sown again last year, as discussed, looking at all the maps of all the rainfall, we all know that it was a pretty late sow last year, and it's going to be late again this year. Maybe those early aphid flights that we trapped early that were positive for the virus, there was no canola for it to go onto, so the aphids were unable to infect that canola, so we had no great crop losses there. The other thing is there's probably very effective management practices. The sites that we went to are all commercial sites, so they have an effective insecticide spraying regime in place. It's also quite dry, so perhaps there's not enough build-up over the summer, or the movement of the aphids was actually quite limited. we'll be looking at the Greenbridge with Martin this coming season. We've got some Greenbridge results that we'll be looking at. The results, when we compared these to the national findings, our results are almost identical to what they saw in Victoria last year. Very similar patterns of infection, which is not too surprising. They're pretty close, especially to the southeast. Western Australia, however, last year had some early infection, which did result in losses last year in some of their locations. So it's definitely still a present danger in some locations. So this year we're going to be doing the same sort of thing. We're going to be looking at trapping for 2025. We'll be doing a little bit of that early field sample to see if the crop itself is infected early. But the weather this year, you know, we're not even sure how the canola is going to go at all this year. So we'll just see how we go. We're going to be looking further afield to see if we can still trap the green peach aphid further afield and give a few more data points to our maps. And we're also looking at the Greenbridge and what effect that has on the virus for this pathosystem. So we're working with Martin and with Precious, who's working on the Canola Allies project. And Martin has a turnip yellows virus sniffing dog, which we might like to use, but it's not trained for turnip yellows virus. It just happens to detect turnip yellows virus. We're co-locating a lot of these trials for next year so we can try to get as much information as possible for us. Kiflu has been doing a heap of work for us in this project. He's been doing all of the analysis, and Beck has been counting aphids for me, and thank you very much to Beck and Kiflu for that. And this is part of the GRDC Effective Virus Management in Grains Crops project. Okay, thank you.
That brings us to Q&A session. So please use the Q&A tool to ask any question you may have.
Wendy is asking whether drought affects survival or maturation of certain larvae, and specifically wireworms. So for those who do not know what wireworms are, so they're the larvae of click beetles, and they can, in the larval stage, live in the soil sometimes for several years before they will actually emerge as adult beetles, which often gives very fluctuating levels of beetles between years. So typically those larvae that live in the soil and have a very long development will, of course, not grow as much when it's a very dry period and when there's no roots available, because that's where they feed on. No Greenbridge, no roots underground where they can feed on. That will slow down their development. I'm not sure how well they will be able to survive, how long, but I expect that they're very resistant and they can probably do quite a long time without food. Probably survive a summer with no food at all quite easily. And then as soon as the winter comes and crops and roots are starting to grow, they will start developing again. And then potentially they will come up some years later. So I think this is typically an example of a very resistant type of insect with larvae deep in the soil. They will go down where there's still a bit of moisture, because otherwise they also dry out. And they'll be feeding on anything that is growing. And if they're not feeding, they'll just sit and wait, because it's very difficult for a larvae in the soil, of course, to move large distances to find roots. So those insects are usually very well adapted to low food conditions. Does the fall armyworm exist in South Australia? If so, how the environmental insect like droughts can influence the pest damage? Does it exist in South Australia? It's a good question. We have not found it in South Australia so far. I would not be surprised that there would be fall armyworms in South Australia today, but not as a pest. They will probably be adults that can migrate over very large distances and that have made it, for example, from New South Wales into Gippsland, where there's been a few reports. But the climate here in South Australia is not adapted to fall armyworms, so they will not be able to establish. They might do maybe a generation or two at the end of a summer if they arrive very late, if there are summer crops. But what summer crops do we grow They would typically live on things like corn and sorghum, which we hardly ever grow. So we are really not expecting fall armyworms to be an issue, but they will undoubtedly every now and then migrate and potentially do a generation on a few corn plants if there's anything present. South Australia grows very little summer crops, so we're not expecting any big issues with this insect here in South Australia. Prove me wrong. If you see anything suspect, please let us know, because we're really interested in that. Second question is, what is the most important mite species on South Australian agricultural crops? Grains crops, relatively simple, I think, red-legged earth mite. Kym, you agree with that, I presume? We did a project some time ago on that. It's really the most important mite species. Of course, there's other mites around, quite a few, and it is important to make sure that you recognize the mite species. So in those links that you can quite easily find doing a Google search on the internet, you can find the keys to recognize the different species. And it's very important to know what species it is, because some species have quite a high resistance. Red-legged earth mite can have resistance to quite a few pesticides. So also for that, there's quite a bit of information available on the internet. So be very precise when you see something that is mite damage and you find mites, to make sure that you know what species it is. Last question is one for probably Kate and Kym. What are the best pesticides using in baiting methods for controlling slugs and snails? Kym and Kate?
I can certainly answer that. There's not that many options in relation to baits for mollusks. Baits are the only registered control method for them. Most of them are based on metaldehyde, active ingredient. And of course, there's a range of formulations, pellet formulations, things like flour base or bran base, or extruded pellets. There's quite a range of formulations of metaldehyde these days, and they all have different properties in relation to field persistence, how they soften up after rainfall and that sort of thing. I would just recommend going to page 26 of the GRDC Nail the Snails Management Guide, and there's a list of products and properties to help you choose.
So if you have any additional questions, feel free to contact us, so we'll get back to you. And that brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you everyone for attending to our webinar today, and a big thanks to our presenters for sharing all their expertise with us. We will say goodbye for now, and we hope that everyone has a great day. So thanks again.